Today, we are going to have our talk on techniques for scientific presentations, how to captivate an audience with your data. And our speaker is Dr. Sarah Thomas. She's a postdoc in the Department of Pathology, where she studies Ewing sarcoma. She's going to tell you more about her background, but I just wanted to tell you where she is now, and then we will get started. If y'all come in later, just make sure to sign in and grab an evaluation, and if you need cookies during it, just go for it, okay? So, Dr. Thomas.
All right, it's officially the afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for coming to my talk today. The irony is not lost upon me that you're evaluating my PowerPoint presentation skills and a presentation on how to be a good presenter of PowerPoint. Please be kind. All right. So, uh-oh. It's on. Uh-oh. Okay, we're good. We're good. False alarm. All right. So a little bit about me. I'm from Virginia. I'm from Waynesboro, Virginia, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours west of here. But I do have family from Richmond. My grandmother lived here for a long time. My mother grew up here, and so I visited her when I was a child. My father and mother met because he went to VCU. So they know Richmond really well. And I really love Richmond, so I was glad to come here and be at VCU. A little more about me. So I got my bachelor's in biology from James Madison University here in Virginia, where I studied essentially neuroscience. Then I got my Ph.D. in cellular biology at the University of Georgia, kept the Bulldog theme. There I studied parasitology and a little bit of drug discovery. And then currently I'm a postdoc in the Department of Pathology, where I study a pediatric cancer called Ewing sarcoma, and we are interested in protein degradation pathways in that particular cancer. But enough about me. What are my qualifications to tell you people how to give a good PowerPoint presentation and captivate people with your data? Well, first of all, I have around a decade of experience giving PowerPoint presentations, more just listening to them, but a decade of actually presenting them. The audience has ranged from 1 or 2 people to many people. This was a really good presentation that day. The audience has ranged from lab mates, students, friends, colleagues at local, regional, and international conferences. And the subject ranged from my data, other people's data, such as for journal clubs, lecture slides for classes that I've TA'd for and have been an instructor of record for. And the length ranged from anywhere from 10 minutes, a very short, to very long, a few hours for like a committee meeting. So my experience as a PowerPoint viewer is probably very similar to your own. And that is, of the innumerable PowerPoint presentations I've seen, most were boring. Some were very good. Some were great. Some were more of a work in progress, but for the most part, most were boring or not very interesting. And I think the issue with that is because I couldn't really follow the presenter. I didn't understand the topic they were talking about. But I will say, PowerPoint doesn't have to be that way. I believe one of the key issues with improving our communication through PowerPoint is setting reasonable expectations for ourselves, the presenter, and for the audience for what we're capable of communicating, and in particular what the audience, you the viewer, are capable of comprehending and understanding through PowerPoint. So today we're going to cover, the purpose of today's talk is I'm going to provide advice and examples, specific examples of how to improve communicating your story through PowerPoint. There's going to be 3 main parts. First will be actually making your presentation. Second will be practicing your presentation. And third will be performing your presentation and other fine details. I do have a few disclaimers. First, most of my talk is my subjective opinion. I'm a cellular biologist, so there's going to be a lot of cell bio talk in here, but I think in terms of science itself, and even just PowerPoint presentations in general, there's a lot of crossover. But you'll have to be the judge for whether my advice will fit into your work or your presentation or not. You'll have to be the judge. I will say that if you're guilty of any of my do's or don'ts or whatever, congratulations, me too. I have one of my old slides up here as an example of what not to do. We all learn. All right, so step 1, creating the presentation. Failing to plan is truly planning to fail. Before you start putting slides together, you need to plan out what you're able to present in the time you're allotted, and then what are the key points you need to make in that presentation. So your goals for presentation planning are 1, to redefine your job. This is sort of just a mental shift. Instead of considering PowerPoint simply a means of throwing up information and tossing it over to the audience to absorb like a sponge. Instead, your job isn't as a presenter anymore, it's a storyteller, where your job, really your duty, is to carefully guide the audience through the key points that you want to make. And that's, I think, a very important distinction. You're not expecting the audience to do the heavy lifting. You are. You're the one who does the heavy lifting, not the audience. Secondly, you need to determine the scope of your story when you're planning. All right, we're going to talk about what scope is on the next slide, but essentially it's how in-depth you're going to go. And thirdly, you're going to want to generate an outline, even if it's taking one of those paper towels from the lab that never absorb anything, and write down on that paper towel what you want to present, your beginning, your middle, and your end. So your beginning, typically for a scientific talk, is your background, rationale, why do you care about it, things like that. Your middle is going to be the bulk of the story probably, so basically what did you do, what happened. And then in the end, the ending part will be your final conclusions, your, I guess, ideas for future plans. For a lab meeting, it could be, and everything failed, I don't know what to do, here's some ideas, please help me. That's still an ending, but hopefully not for a talk. All right, so what is scope? Scope is more than just, it's not slide number or word count, it's the size or the complexity of the story that you're telling. So to give an example, so a story with a wide scope, or really the whole apple tree, would be my dissertation defense. I had 2 specific aims, sub-aims, rationale for both, background for both, future plans for both. It was a lot of information. It was very in-depth, but that was the purpose. So I talked for about an hour. A medium-sized scope, or just really one branch of the tree, would be a research in progress talk. So I only focused on one specific aim, really just one part, and fleshed that out. And I had a little less time to do it, 25 minutes. And then for a narrow scope, where you only have about 15 minutes, I gave a department retreat talk where I only focused on data from like a rationale for what would lead me to ask other questions, and maybe a little preview of things to come in my future work from a one specific aim. Now, as you'll see on this slide, time limit will have a very big impact on the scope and therefore the complexity of your story. So in terms of how to figure out, well, if I've got this much time, how do I define my scope? A general rule of thumb is, well, first you want to set how many slides you can have. A general rule of thumb is 1 slide per minute. I realize some people can maybe do 2. That's fine, but in general, especially if you're a beginner, aim for 1 slide per minute. So you've got a 60-minute talk, not including Q&A, 60 slides. You can increase or decrease depending on what you talk about, but just as a starter for negotiations. Number 2, do not try to cram 45 minutes of talking into a 30-minute presentation. Like you have an old presentation, it worked great in the 45 minutes. Don't try to cram that into 30 minutes, because if you speed read or try to rush through it, your audience will suffer for it. They won't understand the key points because you're rushing. You don't want to have to rush. You don't want your audience to do the heavy lifting. Next, don't spend more than 5 minutes on a slide. If you have to spend more than 5 minutes explaining something on a slide, chances are it's too complex. You need to break it up into separate slides with separate points, again, to not overwhelm your audience and to not have them do the heavy lifting. And lastly, my throat's getting kind of dry. Does the time limit they give you include Q&A? Sometimes people, they don't tell you, and you don't want to assume it. So in general, I would say for a longer talk like today, I would assume maybe 15 minutes. So I want to talk for around 45, have 10, 15 of questions. If you're giving a shorter talk, then 5 minutes of Q&A is fine. But check the people who have invited you to speak. You don't want to assume, oh, that time is the time I can talk. It may include question and answer. Later on, I'll tell you to bring water with you. It's very useful. Okay. Another factor that will affect your scope and the complexity of your story is your audience. Who's going to be in your audience? They could be experts. They could be students. They may not be scientists. In any case, you want to cater your presentation generally to the least informed of the group. And that means you need to get everybody on the same page in terms of the background, meaning that you may have to go more in depth than you originally planned, depending if whoever invited you to talk, ask them who's going to be in the audience. If you're in a job interview, ask them, whoever invited you, who's going to be in the audience. That'll tell you the scope that you should aim for in your talk. So here's an example outline. I talked about once you figure out your scope, how can we adjust our scope and our outline and number of slides to get our, I guess, our complete finished product. So for example, for a 60-minute talk, we'll say 45 minutes of me actually talking, 15 of Q&A. I'm going to do a little plug for my How to Perform Chromatin Immunoprecipitation talk. So in my beginning, I figure will probably be 5 to 7 slides. I'll give background on what CHIP is, I'll give background on the analysis of it, just to kind of set the stage for everybody, because most people in the audience will be scientists. I won't have to define what chromatin is, for example, or DNA or anything like that. Then, my middle, that's where the bulk of the presentation is going to be. We're talking 25 to 30 slides, and I'll go into detail, provide explicit details of each step of the protocol, troubleshooting, where to go wrong, recommendations, all that. That's obviously the bulk of the presentation. And in my end, I want to maybe show some actual data, show some of the analysis of the data, maybe some of the things I've done wrong, and then maybe some ideas about the future of CHIP. Again, this will only be like 5 to 7 slides. And so you can see I've got roughly, 40, 45 slides. That's what I'm aiming for. It can decrease or decrease depending on, I guess, how fast I am getting through the slides. I might need 60, but I'm still within that time limit. Now, let's say I have only 30 minutes. What do you do, assuming a similar audience, what do you do if you only have 30 minutes? Well, I'd say keep the background pretty similar. You still want to bring everybody up to the same page in terms of the background. So I'll still talk about, what's CHIP and how do you analyze it, all that. But then the middle, that's where you're going to really slash and burn. Instead of doing 25, 30 slides, that's when you want to do probably 13 or 15. At least that's what I would do. And instead of going into explicit detail, I would probably provide more general guidelines in terms of the steps and maybe go less into the troubleshooting. And then for my end, I'd still want to maybe conclude with maybe just a simpler set of data. Again, nothing too complicated, but to kind of nicely finish, we've gone through this whole protocol, here's an example data set, we'll work through it together. That kind of idea. But as you can see, the number of slides has definitely changed. Now, if I'm talking to an audience who, I reach out and say, hey, who's going to be in the audience? Oh, it's going to be people who aren't scientists. Well, my background will probably triple, depending, because I need to talk about, and essentially, the end will just be the step-by-step protocol, if that's a non-scientific audience. So you really have to consider your audience in terms of your number of slides, and ultimately for your scope. Okay. You've got your outline, you've got your plan, wonderful. Now what? Well, now you can start making slides. Your slide design is going to be very, very important in terms of the communication. You're going to be a communicator, but so are the slides, so both have to be in sync. So your goals for slide design are choose a theme and color scheme that won't be distracting. Choose a font style and size that people can see, people can read, and to highlight important points. Organize your words and select images that clearly make your points on the slide. So the questions you must constantly ask yourself when you're making a slide for a presentation are, number one, will this overwhelm or distract the viewer? We're going to get into examples of what that is exactly. Is this big enough to see? Depending on the font, generally you want to be above 25-point font. Again, it depends on the style of font, but generally high 20s, low 30s, or higher depending if you're on a title. If it's the title, it should probably be the largest, but you want to make sure it's big enough to actually see. Is this information essential? This will be important not only in how you want to write how the text that you choose, like the words you actually write, but also even in image selection. You want to make sure, is this essential information that I'm communicating in the image? We'll get to that in a minute. And then lastly, am I clearly making my points? And that kind of falls back to essential. But even if it is an essential thing, is it clearly communicating the point I want to make? If not, edit it, remove it, change it. All right, so an example of how slide design can get in the way of your message and how to fix it. So here we have a slide that I found online and kind of edited to make it worse, but not by a lot. And as you can see, there's a lot going on here. And you might think I'm exaggerating, but I've come close to seeing similar things in other talks in terms of the amount of information here. The only part I kind of like about this slide is the very top. I prefer slides that are white with a little pop of color, not just a stark white, but white with a little pop of color and dark text. People can see it. Projectors, at least nowadays, are really good at projecting that. If you choose like a blue background or green, it can be very jarring to the eyes, I think, of the audience. That's a personal preference, but I'd highly recommend choosing white slides with like a little pop of color. That's the only part of the slide I like. So working from the top, anyone, we're going to have some audience interaction here, wake up. So starting from the title here, what are some things that strike you as, I guess, limiting communication here? The font style, okay. What else?
The color, it's too faint.
The color's too faint. Light, light colors on a light background or dark colors on a dark background are going to be your enemy. You need to communicate. People can't see it. What else?
It's downshifted too much.
It's downshifted too much. Why is it downshifted?
Because they're trying to avoid that background.
Yeah, they're trying to avoid the background. Also, there's too many words.
Yeah.
Typically, a title should be, I mean, granted, I know I have some titles up here that have a lot of words, but I've increased the size of the font. You can still read it. But this, for the point of this slide, essentially, it's how are rivers formed? That's the whole point of this slide. So instead of saying, I don't know, rivers are made through a combination of many factors, how are rivers formed? You want your title to simply and succinctly communicate to your audience, really in an instant, what are you talking about? What is this? Is this an outline, a conclusion of a figure, something? This is what I'm talking about. It's big, it's bold, it's easy to read, a dark color and a light background. Great. What about the rest of the slide?
Too many walls.
Too much what?
Too many walls.
Too many words, yes. Way too many words. Okay, what else?
Background is really distracting.
The background's really distracting. I've seen this occasionally where, I mean, I get it, you want to have a picture, you like the picture, but when you have, especially a multicolored picture in the background, no matter what color of text you choose, it's going to be hard to read those words on that kind of background. So, obviously, getting rid of that picture, too many words, and I don't like bullets with more than 2 lines in them. If you need to write more than 2 lines, you need in a bullet, like 3 or 4, split it up into other bullets or sub-bullets. Okay, it's a lot easier to read, and you'll see that later. So let's get rid of that background, and I'm not expecting you to read this, but a lot of this information wasn't even about how rivers are formed. Again, we're going back to those questions. Is this essential? No, not for how rivers are formed. So instead, I got rid of all that extra information and then just wrote down the essential information. Now, I'd like a photo. I mean, for our purposes, you know, if you're in a rush, this is okay. It's not great, but it's okay. But we can make it better. So I selected another photo I found online that's much better at communicating how rivers are formed. Apparently, they're formed by ice from the mountains, lakes, from rain runoff, all coming together into the structure known as a river that eventually leads to the ocean. This picture clearly communicates that message, whereas the picture of just some random river doesn't really tell. We all know what a river looks like. You typically want to select an image that'll communicate something. Not always, but if you don't select an image that'll communicate something, make it very simple, like a clip art or something. Now you can see when I added my image here, I had to move my text over. It's kind of small, and of course my bullets have gone way past the 2-line limit. So instead, I'm using animations here to gradually introduce the topics, but instead I simplified the bullets, like increased the text size, and then, especially for this last one, where it's like 2, 3, but 6 different lines, way too many. Instead, I just listed out individually, hey, here are the different sources of rivers, boom, boom, and then you can add a graphic to literally show it on your image. You're allowed to use a variety of things to highlight information. You can use animations to gradually introduce text to your audience. You can use arrows that you use through animation, introduce ideas. Don't be afraid to do that. Just always remember, I'm a highlighting fiend. I know I'm guilty of it. Hopefully I haven't done it in this presentation. But you want to limit highlighting things. Like you don't want everything bold and everything arrowed and everything crazy animations. But if taken, with a limited amount, you can get your message across very simply and very easily. All right, so now that we've kind of demonstrated how text and now especially how images can be really important to your presentation, we need to talk about image selection. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. Don't expect your audience to read 1,000 words, and by that, you want to select images that aren't overly complicated. Each image must strike a balance between informing and overwhelming. You want to inform with detail. You're going to need some detail in most images, but you don't want to include so much detail that your audience is lost. So the question you ask yourself is, does this image clearly communicate the point that I'm trying to make? So examples of images that overwhelm or get in the way. So you just Google terrible PowerPoint slides. You get some fascinating slides from the government, apparently. Not judging here, but I mean, this is amazing. My favorite part is simplification on a slide that is anything but simple. I love it, actually. But if we want to focus on the images themselves, there are copies of a similar image. There's a mirror image of the same image. Why? The point here here is that these images do not serve a purpose other than to show you how not to use images in PowerPoint. I mean, they're interesting, and I love all these arrows leading to, I don't know what, leading to wisdom. But again, it's too complicated. It's too much information. We have to use images with a purpose. Even if it's a simple purpose, like you want to put in a picture of a river, cool, make it simple. Kind of break up your text, but don't overly complicate things. So let me do a more scientific specific example. I think we've all seen, I don't know how many biologists are in the audience, but I'm sure you've taken biology at some point, and you've probably seen these lovely cell signaling pathways. I know I have. These sorts of images are great for a review article or a journal article or a textbook. In my opinion, they're horrible for PowerPoint presentations. And the reason why, number one, I mean, this is a high quality image. They're not always high quality, but this is a pretty high quality image. Number one, despite the high quality, you can't read the text. And even if you say, oh, no, Sarah, I'm going to point to one little corner, that's all well and good, but the human mind tends to wander. Even if I'm pointing at this one little part here, your mind is going to take you over here, and you're not listening to me anymore. And it's nothing against you, the presenter. It just means that that's human nature. The mind will wander. Your job as the storyteller is to force the viewer, force the audience to focus on your point. And selecting an image that is not complicated focuses, I mean, you could literally have zoomed in and cut this out right there and enlarged it and made your point. You're forcing the audience to focus on what you want them to focus on. If you put up a complicated image, they're going to get distracted, they're not going to listen to you, and your point will be lost. So here's an example. I've grayed out the text. Don't try to read it. The point is not the text. This is one of my old slides where back in Georgia, I studied a African parasite that infected people called Trypanosoma brucei. That's not the important part. The point is that this slide I wanted to say, hey, subspecies of this parasite are in one part of Africa, and then they're in another. And this is the lovely image that I selected to communicate that point. I guarantee you, you're looking at this and you're thinking, yep, that's Africa. That is the only thing you can see. That's Africa. I hope you can see that. I don't know. That's Africa. Yep. But the point of where the parasite occurs, there's red, there's yellow, there's green, there's blue. Oh my, and then there's this legend that nobody can read. Why? It's not essential. Remember those questions I said to keep asking yourself? Is it essential? Not that legend. I don't need to know how many kilometers this is. It's not essential. Is it clearly making my point? Not at all. Needs to go. I'll show one later where it's a little better. So what about when you need to use a complex image? So here's a nice high-quality resolution pathway, one of the cell signaling pathways that I study in protein degradation. You say, oh, I need to present this. Really? Why? Well, I just want to go over the general steps. Well, in that case, stop. If you just want to go over the general steps of a pathway, don't include all these details unless you really, really have to. And you're like, well, what do I do? You can make a flowchart. PowerPoint has SmartArt. You can go to the Insert tab, click on SmartArt, it'll make it for you. So I converted this image into a much simpler, step-by-step, just the general steps that could have served my purpose to explain what things are, what's going on in the cell in this pathway that I studied. But what if you look at me, it took about 15 minutes to make, it's not too much of a time investment. But what if you look at me and you go, no, I really need all these details. I gotta hit every single detail in this image. Well, you can. You just zoom in. Now this will require a high resolution image. I'll go back. So I'm just zoomed in right here. So zoom in. There's step 1 and 2. You, the audience, can now see much more clearly what's going on. Again, if I start pointing, oh, this happens, then this happens, what's your mind going to do? You're going to start looking over here. You're going to look at these purple Doritos. You're going to look at everything but what I'm talking about. So instead, zoom in, talk of only a couple points here, talk, leading to the next part, talk, because with a pathway it's much easier to follow when you can see it. And then moving on, giving mind a bell, and then you can finish with this slide and just summarize, but not expecting them to, walk through that whole slide with just that. So what about when I need to present a figure of data? Most of us are scientists or students who want to be scientists, or even medical doctors who deal with data. How do you present it effectively? So I threw together this slide from just a random paper from a journal club. This wasn't used in the journal club, but it's just a typical slide that I see in a lot of presentations. You'll see the figure title at the top, and then all of the figure panels on one slide. Now remember what I said about distractions of the eye. Even if you do your due diligence, talk, the mind's going to wander. There are a lot of points being made on this slide. Each of these panels is a different experiment, a different question, possibly a different method, probably a different method. So I say you shouldn't do this because, again, your audience has to do the heavy lifting. Your audience has to focus. Your audience has to draw conclusions and learn all of it from you talking. Sorry, my voice is going out. Speaking of talking. All right. So instead, just like with the cellular pathway, break it up. You can zoom in. Great, now I can actually see the data. Who would have thought that you need to see the data to interpret it? So now, not only do I have room to enlarge these, but now I can write down the important points that I need to make. And so I can say the important points, and now you can read them as well and go back and forth. This is a much better way of communicating data. I will recommend that in general, I wouldn't put more than 2 panels on a slide. It depends on the size of the panel. Maybe it's really, really tiny, put 3. But generally 1 to 2 is what I recommend. So I have 2 here, text, 2 there, text on the bottom, that's perfectly acceptable. Let's say you have something more complicated with a lot of points, and you have like 3 or 4 points to make. Don't cram it all on the bottom. Copy and paste the slide. And this is the same image, but I'm just changing the text at the bottom. That's allowed. I promise I won't tell the PowerPoint police, they're not going to get mad. All right, so other advice on images, because images are very, very important. And this is especially for the students. If you put it on the slide, you better be ready to talk about it, especially if it's a committee meeting. They've got enough ammunition as it is, and if they look at you and go, what are these forks? And you're like, oh dear, and you have no one else to blame but yourself. You better be able to say that's a post-translational modification. You better say those are sugars. You better say those are glycans. You better know what OGT is. Because if you don't, you put it on the slide, you better know how to talk about it. And if you don't want to talk about it, don't put it on the slide. They'll probably still ask you, but don't put it on the slide. All right, so of course, use high-quality images. It kind of goes a little without saying, but I will say in my experience, for smaller images, I would recommend at least, so smaller meaning probably, oops, not yet. Smaller images probably half this size. 500 pixels per inch, at least. For the ones where I had to zoom in, at least 1,000 per inch, 1,000 pixels per inch. If you can't find a high enough quality image, I wouldn't recommend using it. Also use simpler images. Again, you want to make simple images, make simple points. So remember my whole, Africa epidemiology kind of story of where the parasites occur in Africa. You really can't see anything or decipher anything here. This image is much simpler. This subspecies occurs here. This subspecies occurs here. There's sort of this dividing line. Darker colors mean you have a more, basically an epidemic of infections, and lighter colors are less frequent. That's much easier to understand. You can see it's Africa, but now you can see that that's where the subspecies occur. A little note about fluorescence microscopy. This is obviously very specific to the type of research that you do or the type of data that you look at, but I can even tell here. These are actually really good projectors, but sometimes if you have a beautiful image on your laptop and you look at the projected image, it's normally much worse because the laptop just has higher resolution on it. And so your projector will essentially modify your image to the point where your audience can't see the color anymore. I would recommend, number 1, avoid dark blue on a black background if you can. I have a hard time seeing it. Sometimes you can't help it, but I'd recommend not doing it. That being said, if you're forced to have dark blue on black, or any color really, you're going to want to try to get access to the room to see how it looks on a real projector, because you would be shocked how wonderful it looks on your laptop and how terrible it can look on a projected image. I will say you can kind of get around it by increasing your brightness and contrast. This isn't for publication. Try to do it for your control versus your variable. But in any case, use arrows like this, like in this paper. Use arrows to point at important things. It's very hard sometimes, I think, unless you're a microscopist, to analyze this data. So you want to, again, lead your audience through it by pointing out important things. All right, so now practicing the presentation. You don't want to be that person who literally gets up there and stands with their back to the audience, reading. So then your audience is going to wonder, what are you doing? Did you practice at all? It makes you look like you didn't care. Why should I care? You don't want to be that person. So instead, you have to ask yourself, well, number one, why should I practice other than not to stand with your back and read every PowerPoint slide bullet? One reason, and I love my image selection here, you might think you're, talking like this, when instead you're just flailing all over the place. You really don't sound the way you think you do. Trust me. So you're going to want to practice on your own and then find some sort of trustworthy witnesses who will be honest with you and tell you, how do you sound? How do you look? Is this confusing? Other reasons to practice are comfort and ease, especially if you have nerves. Also, you want to get your timing precise. Even if you're a seasoned veteran, you need to practice that. Timing is very important. Your time's important. People who talk after you, their time is essential, so you want to be respectful of that. Practicing also gives you an opportunity to smooth out any transitions. It can help you identify, parts of the story that you don't really think are that important anymore now that you're actually saying it out loud. It can change your perspective. And of course, when you practice in front of other people, it could all make sense in your head. But when other people hear it, they're going to point out things that you never even considered. Like, this doesn't make sense to me. You misspelled our boss's name. Things that you never would have imagined. But it's important to have those people help you. So first, you're going to want to start practicing by yourself. Furry viewers are okay. You'll perform the presentation just like you would for the audience. Don't just sit there in front of your laptop and pretend. No. You get Pugsley, you set them in front of you, you take your laptop or your computer, whatever, face it out to your audience. If you can stand. If you have to sit down, like if you can't stand for a long time, have a seat. But still, mime what you would do normally for an audience. That is truly practicing. So you don't want to cut yourself short and think you're practicing by just sitting and looking at your laptop. Also, I'll point out, especially if you're either nervous or you don't have a lot of time to find friends to practice in front of, we all have iPhones or some sort of recording device. Videotape yourself. Plug the phone in, and then watch it back. It can really tell you, are you standing like this? Are you moving strangely? Are you speaking in a monotone? Like, that'll tell you, and you won't sound the way you think you do. It's totally normal, but it's a great tool to use if you want to get some perspective on how you sound. Goodness. All right. So how to practice with a human audience. First of all, you're going to want to find people to practice in front of. And typically, I would say finding colleagues who have experience in science, who are in your field, those are going to be the best because they're going to be able to interpret the results, interpret your slides, and think of questions. They'll be able to analyze what's happening in front of them with much more complexity than, say, a family member or a friend who has no science experience at all. But I will say, if you can't find someone in your lab or your boss or whatever, find a friend. Find a friend who's not in science. They can still tell you how you look, how you sound. They can still offer very constructive, important feedback. When you do have your viewers, instruct them, how do I look and sound? Do they understand your slides? Even people not in science, they can say, that's not big enough. I can't see that. I can't see that image. I don't understand this. That's important information. Are there any missing points, spelling errors? And of course, write it down. You're not going to remember it. Trust me, you're not. Write down what they say. Give them copies of your slides and have them write down things if you don't want them interrupting you. Okay, so what if you're nervous about public speaking? So, despite my voice going out multiple times, I'm not very nervous. I think I'm just a little dehydrated. But I will say some people who I've worked with and who I've been friends with have been so nervous they're literally shaking. And this was in a class for public speaking with like 10 people. It wasn't a very big audience, and she knew all of us, but she was so nervous of standing in front of people she didn't know really how to handle it. I would say the best advice for handling nerves is to practice. Practice, practice, practice. I was able to witness multiple times with multiple people that people, even if they're shaking, when they practiced alone, videotaped themselves, practiced with a few trusted friends and loved ones, and gradually, it took work, but gradually worked their way up, they were able to confidently and adequately present a presentation in public speaking or with PowerPoint. And so it's very possible, I've seen it done myself. So the key though is practicing. Another question that's come up is, do you need a script? I've never needed a script, but I would say making a script and using one, it depends. I think writing one and practicing with one is a great way to learn your material, feel at ease, get over any nerves, but I wouldn't recommend using it during your presentation. All right, think about it. If we go to a play, do the actors take the script up with them on the stage? No. Why? Because they're a professional, and so are you. So make your script if it makes you feel better. Practice with your script if it makes you feel more confident, but always with the thought in mind that you're going to set that script aside and never look at it again. And then you practice without it. Take the training wheels off, practice without it. All right, so another part of practicing, again, you're not just going to be reading text on your slide. You're going to want to do what I call walking through the slide. So that means you take your audience, your viewers, step by step through the information. So you'll explain figures individually. You'll remind the audience of key pieces of information. So you'll say, earlier, we wanted to know what the effects of knockdown of protein A were. So, next slide, we've decided to study this sort of technique. You want to constantly remind your audience where they've been, what you're looking at now, and where they're going. Again, they're not going to do the heavy lifting. They're not going to remember. You're throwing a lot of information at them. It's your job to constantly remind them, even if you said it earlier, constantly remind them of where they are, okay? And of course, don't expect the audience to remember or connect dots. You connect them. You remember. And of course, explaining figures and images individually. So in this example, I would focus on, in this experiment, we knocked down IL-1R1. We confirmed that with qPCR. Then when we looked at luminescence levels, we also confirmed that the knockdown could have effects on protein levels. Then we moved on to the next question, which were what were the effects of macrophage colonization? And then go on, go on, go on. All right, so balancing verbal and written communication. I think I've touched on this a little already. Sorry. So you'll want to say your key points out loud to your audience, obviously, as I'm doing now. But you're also going to want to have your key points written on the slide, your essential points, your hypothesis, your results, your conclusions, any major point you need to make, it needs to be written on the slide and spoken. And the reason for this is that people comprehend information in many different ways. They prefer possibly visual cues. They may prefer auditory cues. They may like both. Again, I think most people probably switch around. So they'll listen to you talk, but then they'll see something, they'll read it, they'll get distracted by that, but they're still on the topic. Then they'll see you point to something, you got their attention again, so they'll listen to you, they'll go back and forth. You want to give your audience those options to comprehend information. That way, they won't get lost. I think my ultimate point here, and this is what I see a lot, if you put your figures on a slide and then only speak the key points, I guarantee you minimally some, if not most of your audience is going to be lost. And that's why I don't like images like this. Because guess what? I'm just going to talk. Key point, key point, key point. I'm saying it, but I'm not writing it. Now you have to remember it. Now you have to memorize it. Now you have to hear me clearly and hear every word. And I'm saying complex things. So that's asking a lot of your audience. Okay, so we've made our presentation. The slides look great. We've practiced it. You feel confident. I'm ready to go. Not yet. First, you need to gather a little intel, all right? So what props or technology are you going to need? Do you need to bring a laptop? Do you need to bring water? Do you need to bring a chair? I've had, I used to be, back when I was a grad student, we would have speakers who would tell us, I cannot stand for an hour. I need a chair. Thankfully, they told us because normally there wasn't a chair there, so we would get them one. That's an important detail. If they needed a whiteboard or speakers or a mic, tell the people who invited you, because if you show up and none of those things are there, then you're kind of in trouble. All right, on to attire selection. So in my experience, I have truly seen it all, men and women, and I've seen it at professional conferences. The question that I've come up with to help you gauge whether you should wear it is, could I actively choose to wear this to the gym or to a nice party? If the answer is anywhere near approaching a yes, don't wear those items. So here are some examples of what not to wear. Before you think, oh, Sarah, you're exaggerating. No, I'm not exaggerating. I've literally seen this. Postdoc from an Ivy League school wore this. He wore a skin-tight surfer shirt with board shorts. His professional talk with this was an audience of hundreds of parasitologists. Wore that, and it looked like he was ready to go surfing. Good for him. But nobody was talking about his research after that, which was a shame. And at the same conference, I don't know what people were thinking, there was a young woman there. Lovely dress. It was a black cocktail dress. It was cut at the knee, appropriate cut up here, but it cooled down in the back. It was backless, stiletto heels, long sheer hair. She looked lovely for a nice party. But unfortunately, maybe not so much for a professional talk about her research. So again, attire selection needs to simply communicate that you're a professional, just like what you would for a job interview, and also to be comfortable. Again, so a few other things to note. Never anything ratty, never anything dirty. I would think even for a department talk or even your own lab meetings. Granted, if you wear it to the bench, if you wear your, ratty old t-shirt at the bench, your boss probably won't care. But if you're giving a lab meeting, put on a nicer top, put on some nicer shoes, be professional. That, I think, is the minimal expectation. So some examples of what you should wear are what are generally called business casual, business professional. Kind of what I'm wearing. Hopefully what I'm wearing. I am wearing tennis shoes. I forgot to put on nicer ones, but they match. And they're clean, so there we go. For women, I would say, patterns are fine, blazers. I will recommend for men and women, it's always good to bring a blazer or cardigan. A lot of these rooms are very, very cold, but sometimes they're hot. So at least a cardigan or a jacket gives you the option to take a layer off, put a layer on. You don't want to be too hot or too cold. But in either case, for women, nice dress pants, pencil skirts, the knee. Shoes, you can wear a heel, just a comfortable one. Especially, don't try to break in those new shoes, ladies and gentlemen. Don't break them, don't do it. Because then you'll be in pain, you won't be able to talk, your audience will be able to tell, you'll be miserable. You want to be comfortable and confident. And for men, I would say, it depends, but I'd say you'd be fine probably without a tie. It might depend on your field of study or the conference. If I would ask people who have been, especially if it's a conference, ask people who've gone, hey, should I wear a tie? Yes. Hey, should I wear a tie? It doesn't matter, sure, it doesn't matter. But just check in and ask. All right, so other items to remember, bring physical and digital backups of the presentation. If you have a laptop, or you don't, borrow one, bring a physical copy on the hard drive, bring a flash drive, put the presentation on your email, on your Google Drive, on your iCloud, whatever. Because believe me, I have seen presentations where, oh no, you don't have the connector for your laptop. Okay, let me plug in my USB. Oh no, the computer part with the USB is locked. I can only access the presentation from their little module. Let's go to normally 2 out of the 3 will fail. We can't get the Wi-Fi, we're in trouble, we'll have to troubleshoot that. But in any case, 2 out of the 3 will fail, and then the 3rd one will save your tail, okay? Didn't mean to rhyme that, but it works. Note cards, notes, and papers, I'd say those are appropriate for lab meetings, for journal clubs, for things like that, and depending on your committee, even committee meetings, you can ask them. I don't really see a problem with it. I did it, and they didn't mind. But ask them. I wouldn't say it's appropriate for a conference, but it's certainly appropriate for more intimate settings where you need to go into more detail. And of course, water or coffee. So you've gone through your presentation. It went really well. You feel good. How do you handle Q&A? First of all, practicing with your colleagues. I kind of said this earlier. Practicing with your colleagues will help you identify questions that are going to come up and identify answers to give to those questions, especially if you can practice with your boss, practice with your lab mates who really know your work. They can give you ideas for what to expect. But there's always going to be those zany questions you don't see coming. So how do you answer questions? I think it's really helpful, for me at least, that even in a smaller setting like this, where everyone can hear me, or hear the person asking the question, I think it's always good to repeat the question back. Number one, to get clarity and make sure, because some of the questions can get complicated, make sure you understand the question so you can actually answer it. And number two, so everybody in the audience can actually hear the question. This is really important for big spaces when they rarely give a microphone to the person asking a question. And all you hear when you're all the way in the back, so you were running late and you got in there, all you hear is, wah, 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 wah. Yeah, da-da-da-da-da-da. It's like, what is this an answer to? Instead, you say, oh, so your question was such and such. Hopefully they say yes. If no, you just ask them to repeat it. But then, so the answer to this is, now everybody's on the same page. I know the question, now I'm giving the answer because they can hear you. What about complex multi-part questions? So there's always that, normally it's a professor who's like a walking PubMed, who knows way too much information about everything, and they're really excited about your work, and so they're going to give a miniature thesis presentation of their work, followed by 2 or 3 questions. It's fine. So how do you handle that? The best thing to do is to divide and conquer. Address one question at a time and ask them, say, so your first question is such and such. They'll confirm it, you answer that question. Then if you can remember the second, confirm it. Say, so your second question was da-da-da. If you're wrong, they'll happily correct you and tell you whether it's right or wrong. And if you can't remember, I would literally ask, I say, so what was your second question? Again, they will happily tell you. And then you can get clarity and move on. So I wouldn't try to bunch it all together in one answer. Divide them up succinctly and say, so your first question was this, your second was this, your third was this, great. Then you can move on, and it's much clearer to the audience if you break it up that way. So what about when you don't know the answer? First of all, don't lie. You want to know how I know? Because I've lied, and it didn't work. You know how the people who can tell you're lying know? Because they've lied, and they were caught. It doesn't work. The best thing now, it depends on, if you don't know the answer, and let's say it's something really important. You should have known it, you didn't know it, it happens. Still, it's the best idea to admit defeat. Don't say you should have known it. They can draw that conclusion themselves. But say, I don't know the answer, but that's a very important question. I'll need to look that up. At the very minimum, don't just say I don't know. You need to follow it up with validating the question. So that's a very important question. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer. I need to look that up, but thank you for asking. That is a simple, succinct way, and even if it's essential and you should have known it, you've learned your lesson, you move on. But generally, outside of the ones that you really should have known, I think questions that you don't know, generally, this is general, fall into 2 categories. Either A, it's a question that it wasn't essential to know, but it would have been nice to know the answer. It might have been helpful to your project. Something like you never thought about it, but yeah, sure, I could know that. Again, say you don't know. Don't try to speculate. Just say you don't know, but then also, again, just like with essential information, say this is a very good question. I never really thought about this before. I need to look this up. This is very interesting. Just admit defeat in that way. The other type of questions that you don't know are typically ones that are beyond the scope of your project. And typically those happen pretty often, actually, I think, because when you give a presentation on your work, you've got a wide range of audiences, they're going to think of things that are way off the wall. When I gave talks about the African parasite that I studied, there were a few life cycle stages, one in the insect vector, one in the mammalian host. I only studied the mammalian host because form of the parasite because I was interested in discovering drug targets and drugs that could help people. The biology did not translate between insect forms and mammalian forms, so I had no reason to look in the insect form. But people would ask, oh, have you thought about looking in the insect form? The answer was no, that's beyond the scope of my work. And the reason why is because I'm interested in specific questions relevant to the mammalian infective parasite. You have to give a reason. You can't just say, it's not in the scope of my work. You have to specifically say why, and then try to follow up with, but that is an interesting question. If we're interested in, learning more about the biology of the vector form of the parasite, we'll study that. Something to kind of validate the question. So my final thoughts, other than stay hydrated. Preparing a great PowerPoint presentation is a lot of work, but all of that work will serve you very well because, as many of you have learned or are going to learn, being able to be a strong, confident communicator through PowerPoint or in any situation is important not only to communicate your science to the world, which is an essential part of science, but it's also important for job interviews, for interacting with your colleagues, for interacting with other scientists in the world, for interacting with the public. So you want to be able to hone these skills while you can through the presentations that you give with colleagues in small meetings and journal clubs, whatever. Your audience will, of course, greatly benefit from this work, and of course you're going to give me feedback today, and so every presentation you give, you're going to be stronger. which is sort of my last point. So remember, give yourself plenty of time to prepare. You're going to want at least, and this is if you're a seasoned veteran, it's not a high-pressure situation, so it's like a journal club or a lab meeting, give yourself at least a week. That gives you time to put reasonable slides, because these slides, when I say break up the slide, write all this information, that takes time. You're not fooling me. I know why you threw all that data on the slide and put the title up there, because you did it the day before. It's fine, I understand, I've done it. You know, it just means that your audience is going to suffer, though. It's going to take time to break up the figures, and write down in your own words what the conclusion is, what the result is, what the hypothesis is. It's going to take some time, so you want to build in that time. Now, for a higher pressure situation, you're going to want to definitely, like let's say it's a committee meeting, it's a conference, something, a lot of pressure, you're going to want at least 3 or 4 weeks. A week to put the slides together, then a practice, then a week to edit, then another practice, then possibly another week, and maybe even another practice depending on how you do. But at minimum 2 practices and at least 3 weeks of editing, at least. So what about acknowledgements? We're near the end of my presentation. I don't have any acknowledgements other than everyone who's, taught me and listened to me. But who should you include in your acknowledgements? It's not really talked about that much. The first one, and this might be a little obvious, but your PI. Definitely your PI. I've seen presentations where the PI was not included because I guess in the back of your mind you're like, well, duh, it's obvious my PI, but no one knows who you work for. You need to write it up there. And of course, your lab mates, even if they're not involved in your research, they're part of the team. If they're rotating in there, they're part of the team, put them on the slide. It's just a nice thing to do. Next, your committee. If you're a student, include your committee on there. Any collaborators, include the PI's name, include any people from that lab who you directly work with or who have contributed to your work. Any cores that have helped you collect data, so flow core, microscopy, mass spec, whatever, and of course the name of the person that has helped you analyze or collect data because they've contributed to your work. Funding sources, talk to your PI, who, the NIH, American Heart Association, whatever, who's funding your work. You want to acknowledge that. And then of course for your final defense only, you can acknowledge your loved ones, your friends, all that fun stuff, but only for your final defense. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody, and I'll be happy to take any of your questions. Yes?
So I have a question about animations. So I typically, if I'm going to have more text than I probably should, or if I need to list something out, or maybe I have 2 images, I would use animation just to have them appear at different points. Mm-hmm. Do you have a rule that you hold to with that? Because I saw with your images you kept 2 up at the same time.
So, yeah. So what you'll do. So your question is like if you would include. Let me try to find something here. Okay. Yeah. So you would. So your question is, do you also project text by animation and images, or do you just leave images up there? Can you rephrase your question?
Could you go back to the slide where you had there was a bar graph and then it was just those 2.
Yeah.
So I might say put image A up there with its points and then have image B come in. I didn't know if you had a preference.
I think it's perfectly fine to do it that way.
Okay.
I think it's perfectly fine to, I don't necessarily think you have to, but I don't think it's a bad thing if you put up your image of like, let's say, panel A, points for panel A, and then introduce your panel B and your points for panel. I think that's acceptable. I think always with animations, try to keep them simple. Like I always do appear, like the animation appear or fade or whatever. Don't try to do the loopy ones. It can be distracting, but yeah, I think that's perfectly fine. Yeah, again, you want to focus your viewer as best you can, and sometimes, especially if it's a very complex image, you might want to just introduce them piece by piece. That's perfectly fine, yeah. Okay. It's a good question. Anything else? Yes.
I actually have a bit of a question about the question and answering part.
Okay.
Like what I had during my defense of my PhD, well actually not so much the defense, but you're presenting to people that are in a slightly similar field but not your field.
Yeah.
And you're presenting this thing you have worked on for 4 years.
Sure. Your baby, yeah.
And questions came from, well, I knew from which field they were coming, so I could kind of prepare what the questions would be like.
Sure.
But I sometimes have a hard time understanding questions from such another field. Like my first presentation for my interim exam, like the first exam you get after a year. So it's mostly on the like your proposal. And I couldn't get across that I was not gonna analyze what they thought I was analyzing because I called it biomechanics. And in their eyes, biomechanics was just, you need full body biomechanics then. You're gonna do all these calculations of all these body angles. No, I don't need that for the question I have.
I see. Well, it sounds like, so your question is how do you work with, it sounds like there might have been a disagreement between the audience member or the questioner saying, well, if you're going to call it biomechanics, it needs to have A, B, C, and D.
Yeah.
And in your mind, you're like, well, actually, I'm calling it biomechanics with just A and B.
Yeah.
So I would say that the best way to approach questions, like if they start asking questions about this, like, oh, did you test this and that for it to be biomechanics, I would just be honest and say, well, our definition was to simply do this and that. And if maybe they're bold and they'll say, I don't think that's biomechanics, you can say, well, I can certainly redefine that. You know, I wouldn't do not argue. This is not the place to try to do a debate tournament. Simply acknowledge, and in some ways, I would listen to them. I'm not saying you're wrong or they're right or anything. I would definitely listen to them because in science, words are very powerful and meaningful. Like whenever I talked about cell cycle, you know, I had to be very careful about when I talked about separation of DNA versus replication of DNA versus all of these different steps. And some people would mix up mitosis with with DNA replication. It's not the same thing. One was separation, physical separation, one was not. So in general, with questions that you don't necessarily, like there's a disconnect with how you're communicating, I would just acknowledge that whatever they feel is missing, just acknowledge, well, I didn't test that, but I do hear what you're saying that I need to test that, and you see that I need to test this in order to call it biomechanics. And then just conclude, in either case, this is what I observed, because scientists, we always want to focus back on that data. So don't even forget about the semantics at that point. Just try to focus them back on, but this is what I observed. So my conclusions are the same. Like that's the ultimate goal, right? We can argue about semantics all we want, but your conclusions are still the same. So just address that. Say, okay, I acknowledge that, you know, maybe I do need to readdress the words that I'm using, but the data is still the data. Here are my conclusions, avoiding the word biomechanics. Here are my conclusions, and so, and of course acknowledge that. Yeah, that can be very challenging.
It was more that there was no data yet. There was a proposal.
I see.
And it didn't get across. Like I was young, she was.
Yeah. I mean, then in that case, you would say, well, then in that case, sure. I mean, it sounds like the point they were trying to make was that in order to call it biomechanics, you need to test these other things. You can certainly acknowledge that and say, okay, we can add those. I mean, we have discussions in, you know, Q&A of people will bring up experiments off the wall, ones that could actually help your experiment, your project. So you say, you know what, I wasn't originally planning that, but that sounds really interesting. So so acknowledge it. Write it down. Of course, you know, I'm not writing anything down right now, but for your research talks, write down what they say and say, you know what, I'm going to look more into that. That's a very good point. Because chances are it might be very important. So acknowledge that and move on. Yeah. That's a very, very good question, though. Any others? Yes.
As a student, how would you suggest handling references and including them?
I would say, for a PowerPoint presentation, now if you're referencing, it depends. So if you're a student and you are showing data that you didn't collect, I would most definitely write it on the slide, like in a part of the white part where they could it doesn't have to be giant, but you need to acknowledge that that's not your data, because it could be misleading that you collected that data and you didn't. That's one way of referencing. But if you want to reference like a paper from a statement, I would say, in my experience, and I think I did it on a few slides, I tried to, maybe not. Anyway, I generally would put like a very small text at the bottom, a citation. You don't need to put like the asterisks or whatever, or the numbers. I think it's perfectly acceptable to put citations at the bottom for images or for text. Again, you can talk to your PI a little. For a PowerPoint presentation that's just your lab meeting, it may not even be essential. Know the references. I put them in my notes, definitely. So if they ask, oh, where'd you get that information? You'll have that in front of you. But I don't think it depends on the situation on whether you should include it on the slide. The example of data always include that if you didn't collect it.
Yeah, I'm thinking more of a conference or.
Oh, for a conference, in my experience, I really haven't seen that very much, where people will make statements about other people's data or about the literature and actually include the citation. It's very rare. But sometimes I think I might see it occasionally, like they'll literally cite, like say in this paper, I read this, it depends on the tone of their talk, but I've definitely seen like background and all that without like specific like citation, like, APA style citations. I think that's not necessarily essential. But check with your boss because again, I'm in a very niche field, so maybe it could be different in physics or chemistry. Check with them. Yeah.
Can I say something about that?
Sure.
I actually really like when people have citations from which papers, figures, or data came from, especially because I'm starting my line of work. So if I think, oh, that's really interesting, I want to read the full paper. But how am I ever going to find that if they're not
You can read
putting
it
it
though.
on?
You can read the citations.
Well, in our field, they generally put the last name of the first author, the journal that it comes from, and then the year. So
Okay.
it gives you the basic information. It's not
Okay.
the full citation, but you can put it big enough that they
Enough
can see it.
information to
It's
find
enough
it out.
information to find it.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's like what I'll call a modified reference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
they put it
That-
on the
that-
slide, like underneath the figures usually.
That sounds really reasonable. That sounds very useful.
And then you can include the full list of references in the back slide if people actually, want access to your slide later.
Yeah. That sounds like a really good idea too. So that's something I never really considered, but that's a very, very good point, and it sounds like it'd be very useful. Yeah. Since you don't have to go like the full length
I think
citation.
it would also make your presentation stronger, right? Because everybody can validate what you're saying.
That's right, yeah.
So in the interest of time, we'll take one more question if we have any. We're all good. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.